Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I know how it is to sit in the afternoon and listen to a lecture. If you take a little nap, I won't be sad, as long as you come back by the end. All right. Although it's funny, one time I actually won a free cup of coffee at Starbucks because they had a trivia of where coffee came from, and I said, well, it came from the Ethiopian monks who wanted to chew on the beans to stay awake through prayer. So there you have it. You can thank them for that. Right.
I've been going to win Starbucks.
Okay, so this afternoon, I have the privilege of speaking about something that is one of my passions, one of my great loves, which is the saints of the church. I've always been interested, even as a child, about looking at the lives of the saints, the stories of the saints. It's really the place where Christian narrative imagination and real history intersect in very lively ways, because the stories of the saints get retold by different cultures, and you can even see different versions of different saints' lives that will look different in different languages. And it's always been fascinating for me to understand how people in different times and places have clothed men and women, outstanding disciples of Jesus, in different ways according to their models, and how that can shift in time. So at various times in history, certain types of saints will be more popular than others, and that in itself teaches us something about the cultures who were venerating these holy people. And of course, one of the wonderful things about the lives of the saints is that they are meant to inspire. It's a tradition which has something for everyone. All the saints, men and women, some of the most important, powerful stories of saints were of people who were very colorful sinners, let's say, and then they became great holy people. So there's these inspirations that nothing is impossible, that God can work with anything. And in that sense, we're all called to lives of holiness in different times. And so this is what we're going to be thinking about today, especially in the Syriac tradition. I'm going to focus the beginning of my talk on St. Anthony, who's the father of the monks. And of course, he's not Syriac. So some of you are saying, I thought we were going to talk about Syriac saints. Maybe some of you are thinking about, he comes from Egypt. But I'm going to be actually talking about the traditions of St. Anthony in their Syriac versions. And I hope that you'll enjoy that, because by looking at how Syriac traditions remembered St. Anthony, you can see some interesting distinctions about Syriac theologies and concepts of holiness that were part of their idiom. So this is, and I have this beautiful icon from Vatican Syriac 559 from 1220. Of St. Anthony, dressed as a Syrian Orthodox monk here. And to this, I have to thank Abuna Akras, the Syrian Orthodox bishop, who sent that over to me. And I said, do you have any pictures of Syriac St. Anthony? He said, why, yes, I do. And so thank you for that. He's venerated by the Syrian Orthodox on January 17th. Okay, so as we think about St. Anthony, it's important to consider this concept of asceticism, which for some of you might be familiar, but it's worth kind of considering, because Anthony, as the father of the monks, is going to demonstrate what this means for Christians. The word asceticism comes from the Greek word meaning training, so training your body through discipline to glorify God. Glorifying God through your body. And the reason why this is interesting, because of course Greeks and Romans and other peoples, non-Christians, were doing ascetic things. You had philosophers, you had various ascetic movements. But Christianity is going to put a very different spin on it because of the doctrine of the incarnation. Because God becomes human, humans can become like God. And this is something which will be articulated and celebrated, especially in the theology of St. Athanasius at the Council of Nicaea. So the human body is good. You can use your body and train your body to give glory to God. But in order to do that, first you have to tame it. So asceticism comes from this idea that our bodies can tell us to do things which are actually not good for it, that lead us astray. And so you need to retrain it through discipline and through self-control to be able to then use it to give glory to God. So that's kind of hovering in the background of the stories of the monks, of which St. Anthony is honored as this as the founder. So again, it's important to see that as much as sometimes our modern sensibilities can get a little bit overwhelmed by the things that they describe, that they do, it's always for God. Everything there is meant to surprise and make us wonder what is possible by God. And so the stories of St. Anthony are meant to inspire everyone. And this is an Ethiopic, actually, picture here. I love the icons of the Ethiopian saints because they always have those big, beautiful eyes. So aren't those great? Hagiography is the lives of the saints. That's the name of the genre of the lives of the saints. And it's a fascinating subgenre in and of itself because the lives of the saints, as they develop in the early Christian period, draw in from a wide variety of sources. So you take something from the Bible, you take something from history and from myth, and you create these different legends, which are it was a very flexible sort of literary genre for the writers to explore. So for instance, a lot of times when you read the lives of the saints, you'll start to say, gosh, this sounds like something I may have read before. Well, that's intentional because they're supposed to remind you of the stories of the apostles, of the stories of Jesus himself. So very often a saint might perform a miracle which was very much similar to something an apostle performed, or maybe his practices might model something that the prophets of the Old Testament did, something like that. So they're supposed to it's a sort of layered genre. And they're not really meant to be read as historical documents. That's very important. It's a genre which is supposed to just give a snippet about a person, to inspire, just to accentuate a few characteristics of that person's life that can make them worthy of memory. And this is where actually the pictures of the saints, the icons of the saints, can help us as a counterpart. So if you think of the icon as being the visual portrait of the saint, the hagiography, or the life, is the literary counterpart. So in the same way that an icon isn't going to give you all the pictures of a person, but just a few outstanding traits so that you can recognize him or her, that's the same type of thing that happens in the lives of the saints. They're not going to tell you everything. They're only going to tell you what they want you to remember, right? And in a sense, that's how stories get told, right? We always will remember the boldest things, the brightest things, the shocking things. That's what the memory clings to. And so that's an important sort of piece to think about as we go through. Okay. And in the background then too of the saints is that Jesus calls all people to lives of holiness, and that the saints themselves have a special authority that gets recognized sometimes within their own life. So the saints become commissioned by Jesus, right? To spread the word, to challenge people by what they do. So that the most important example of this from the earliest church were the martyrs. So we have many traditions about saints who died for their beliefs, and that experience was seen to model what Jesus himself did. So in the earliest periods of the church, the martyrs were seen as the most exemplary examples of Christian discipleship. But what are you going to do if you can't die for Jesus? Kind of an interesting question. It's a good question. We can't die for Jesus usually, right? In our culture, we have religious freedom. How do you create those own signs of sacrifice, that own sign of what you're willing to do for God? So asceticism too is going to try and answer that question, because one of the things that the monks will do is to show that you have to sometimes sacrifice a lot to get to the truest version of yourself. You have to leave the world in order to find out who you truly are. And sorry, my voice is getting a little bit tired. So we'll see this as we think through the life of Anthony, the father of the monks. In the late ancient period, then, by late antiquity, I should say, that is a time period which is roughly defined from about the middle of the 2nd century into 7th, 8th. It's kind of fuzzy where late antiquity ends, but for our purposes, we can say the 8th century. In this time period, saints themselves become very powerful as mediators of God's love, and this is something which happens historically too. The saints become active in society, sometimes arbitrating in areas which are not even like what we would call religious. So they become sort of they have this power to make decisions, and they get involved in politics. They can get involved in economic interactions and negotiations. And this is a phenomenon that scholars have studied in great detail. So I'm not going to go into that too much right here. But what's important for us theologically is to see that in the reason for this was again connected to the doctrine of the incarnation. Because God became man can become like God and can demonstrate that in a new, powerful way. Humanity especially has a capacity to say something about God because of the incarnation. And so the saints do this in the most outstanding ways. I have a picture here of, which some of you will recognize, the pillar of Simeon the Stylite here, Kalat Siman. We're going to talk about Simeon at the end of the presentation. He's one of the most popular Syriac saints, ascetic superstar, as Peter Brown would say. And here's another picture of two ascetic saints. I always ask my undergraduates, so these Stylite saints, as we'll see, lived on top of pillars as a sign of their devotion to God. And I always ask my undergraduates, why don't we resurrect some of these practices? Who wants to go out to the middle of the quad and set up a pillar? Get right up on top. Let's try that again. And so with the monks, what you'll see a lot of times is an interest in changing the body. And they use very graphic language in the hagiographies to describe this. They'll say, you have to live in your body like a corpse, which sounds a little bit negative. But what they mean is detached from the world. Detached from the world. You die to the world in order to get something else. So asceticism is always an exchange. I'm going to give up something in this life in exchange for something else. I'm going to make that exchange. And one of the things that they realize is that even if you leave the city and go out to the desert to become closer to God, to seek a life of prayer, to seek a deeper relationship with God, single-hearted relationship with God, you're still left with yourself. So even when you go out to the desert, you still have to contend with the voices in your head, right? With the distractions. And here, I think there's always something so important that these monks and the early monastic literature can teach us today, because we are bombarded by distractions in our world. We are bombarded by voices trying to tell us that we're not okay, trying to tell us that something is off, that we need to buy something, we need to eat something, we need someone's approval, whatever it is. It's not what God wants for us, right? These are distractions. And the ancient monks called them demons. They saw those voices as as the emissaries of Satan. Nothing, according to the monks, nothing upsets Satan more than seeing that someone is trying to get closer to Jesus. He gets really angry. So what does he do? He sends these voices in your head. And it's interesting to see, I've been working on a book on the sin of gluttony, actually. It's very interesting, the vice of gluttony in the early church. And the monks, the monastic literature talks so much about vices. And of course, the one which attacks them the most is the one called in Greek akirie, which is hard to translate actually into English, but it means something like disinterest, giving up, sloth. It's that voice which tells you you can't do it. Don't even start. You're going to start this project. Why are you going to even begin? You're never going to finish. It's the one that tells you to give up and despair. And you can imagine that this would be a real experience for people. If you get up in the early morning to pray and you're trying to govern your life with prayer, by the middle of the day, you're tired and you just want to take a break or stop. Or I sometimes tell my students, it's that voice, if you're running a marathon at mile 24 and says, you're not going to finish. Just quit. Can't do it. Or when you sit down to study and you have a nice block of 2 hours to work on your paper, and as soon as you sit down, you check your phone, you send a text, you check your social media, you open the window, and you change your clothes one more time, and 2 hours have gone by and you haven't done anything yet, right? At that point, you know that the demons have managed to get you. So. He gets me sometimes. Anyhow, so out of their practices, the monks would come up with values to help. And fasting is really important because through taming your body with food, you can control it in other ways as well. Also material wealth, so the importance of living with very little. And theologically, the idea was that your life should be one which is constantly entering into the suffering of Jesus, to the passion of Jesus, that your life is always going to be, your life can't ever get too comfortable. If your life has become too comfortable, you're not really a monk anymore. You can't take suffering out of the equation, right? And that is because you look forward to the resurrection. So in the life of Anthony, you're going to see that he suffers a lot. The story will talk about that. He suffers horribly. He gets beaten up all the time. But at a certain point, he's transformed. God takes that and does something beautiful with it, once God has seen the sacrifices that Anthony was willing to make. So after that point then, his life becomes a glimpse into what the resurrected life will be. And so that's a really beautiful part too here that goes on. This is an image of Saints Anthony and Paul. So Paul is another early monastic saint, and they are often seen paired off together. And they were also portrayed as mirroring typologically the prophets through what they did. Now the prophets, of course, too, were sometimes ridiculed for their behavior. So in the background too of monastic literature is the idea that not everyone's going to understand what you're doing. And that's okay. You're going to get mocked. People are going to think this is strange, but God will take care of you. So for instance, in the same way that the prophet Elijah is miraculously fed, in the desert, if you trust in God, God will always take care of you. And there's different concepts and images of monks. So it's kind of interesting just to see, if you look up the word monk, images of monks, you can find all kinds of interesting things on the internet. But for Christian images, here are 3. And you can see this. This was the one in the middle is an Ethiopian monk, and a Syrian Orthodox monk over here. It is backwards. I apologize. When I did my slide, the Syriac script got a little bit messed up, which of course is the work of the demons, who are not going to allow me to have a perfect presentation, because that would not be good for my, so this is great for my humility, anyway, the word, I wonder how many more times I'm going to mess up today to keep me really humble. I'm going to go for maybe 10 more. Ihidoye. So there's a couple words actually in Syriac that are used can be translated as monk. Dairoyo is one. Ihidoye is another. And this is a very rich concept, as some of you will know if you've read Father Sidney Griffith's work on this, because it denotes, and here I'm speaking to the people who come from this tradition. It's sort of like, you all will know this better than I do. But the word is of course connected to Jesus himself, who is the only begotten, the Ihidoyo. So you are, through your single-heartedness, it means single-born, firstborn. You are, through your single-hearted devotion, also imitating Jesus himself, who was the Ihidoyo, and you are also having a life which is singularly linked to God. This is a very rich concept in Syriac ascetic theology. Now, the life of Anthony was written by actually St. Athanasius the Great. And it's one of the most treasured texts in early Christian literature. Maybe some of you have read it. How many of you have read the life of Anthony, just out of curiosity? Oh, many of you. Perfect. Okay, that's great. Well, it was translated into Syriac probably in the 5th century, maybe 100 years or so after Athanasius wrote it in Greek. But what was interesting was that Athanasius is a fantastic saint of unity, because all of the Syriac churches, pre-Christological controversies, honor St. Athanasius. And so much of his corpus, much of the works of St. Athanasius were translated into Syriac. There are many manuscripts that transmit the life of Anthony. Most of them are Syrian Orthodox, although he is also in the Paradise of the Fathers, which is East Syriac, Church of the East, from the 7th century. So he's kind of a nice unity saint. The life of Anthony was written around 356, and the story was really important for the genre of hagiography, because it established what are called sort of literary conventions of how to tell the life of a saint. We're not going to get into that too much today, but that's just a sort of as an aside. Those of you who are interested in translation stuff between Greek and Syriac might be interested to know that there were shifts that happen in the principles of translations. That is to say, as works from the Greek-speaking Christian world, like the life of Anthony, got translated into Syriac, we can see that how those translations were done changes depending on what was going on in history. And Sebastian Brock, of course, has written a lot about this. But sort of as a flashpoint, in the earlier periods, in the 4th and the 5th centuries, we could say that instead of looking for a word-for-word translation, in other words, this Greek word is therefore this Syriac word. What you see is a much more dynamic process where they're looking for the idioms. And so it's not as kind of verbatim. And what the result of that is that they tend to be longer. So the Syriac life of Anthony is much longer than the Greek life of Anthony, because you see that when they translated it, they were more interested in capturing the meaning and expanding upon it a little bit, rather than having precision, which is what we see after the Christological controversies. Then you see a greater concern for precision in translation. This is also backwards, isn't it? Ignore that word. Isn't that awful? Well, luckily, the Syriac up on the other picture is clear. Ehidayutha, or this is a concept in Syriac meaning single-heartedness. We could say that the Syriac life is an idealization of this whole concept. In other words, what you're going to see, which is so interesting, is when they translate the life of Antony into Syriac, they're going to make Antony reflect the values of Syrian asceticism. They're going to turn him into a Syriac monk, even though he was an Egyptian monk and the story was written in Greek. So you can start to see how fun this is. You've got a Greek-speaking Athanasius talking about an Egyptian-speaking monk, Anthony, and I'm going to take this whole thing and turn it into, we're going to send it over to Syria and make it palpable to that audience. This is why the lives of the saints are so fascinating, because things will change and shift in these beautiful ways, kind of a snowballing effect. And you can also see how devotion to St. Anthony is growing by the time that they do this tradition. So I think that's what's one of the fun things of studying different versions of saints' lives. And as I said, in short, the Syriac life is an expansion and a revision of the Greek life. It's not just a word-for-word thing. The earliest manuscripts date to the 6th century, although scholars think that actually the translation took place in the 5th century. So some kind of main points of difference, which I hope this is this interesting to you? I hope so. Okay, I can't presume. Just because I find it interesting does not mean that you should find this interesting at all. But maybe you do. I hope you do. Some things which are distinct about the Syriac Anthony. First of all, there's a lot more language of the Bible. It has much more language and references to the Bible than the Greek. Another really interesting difference is that the way that Anthony is discussed in the Syriac version assumes already that everybody knows that he's a great saint. Does that make sense? In the earlier version, it seems like Athanasius is making a case for Anthony. By the time the life gets translated later, the assumption is, well, we all know that Anthony was a saint. So you see a more elevated portrait of Anthony. He doesn't, you don't hear about his little peccadillos, his little struggles as much in the later version. There's a lot more sensory image in the life of the Syriac life. There's a lot more language of the senses. And you see many of the ideals of Syriac asceticism are going to get pressed upon Anthony. So he is going to exemplify this for them. He talks a lot more. He's much more talkative in the Syriac life. Again, it's an interesting thing. They want to give him more speech. They want to give him more things to say. And in the background, too, is this idea that there's this need to explain Egypt to people who've never been there. Fascinating. In the background, Athanasius doesn't do that because he presumes that people know what he's talking about. Whereas in the Syriac life, there's a lot more explanation about what this place, Egypt, was really like. So you see this distance here. One of the most fascinating theological distinctions is that Anthony is described as an angel of light. That language is totally absent from the Greek life. An angel of light. And the concept of being an angel is very typical for Syriac monastic theology. The monk himself or herself is meant to be an angel, to live a life of the angels. That's the angelic life, transformed, and through transforming your body, you create this capacity to transmit divine light. And that's actually something that people can see. So when you see that, you literally glow, in the stories of the Syriac monks. And so you see that Anthony is demonstrating this. And the monastery itself is described as a Shekinah, the dwelling place or the temple of God. Okay, so this is again the teachings of Egypt to Syrian monks. We discussed this. Also, this is backwards, isn't it? Oh no.
No.
That one is okay because that was part of the icon. There's a nice, clear Syriac going in the proper direction. So as I said, I use the term canonized here. The Syriac St. Anthony is a canonized Anthony, and by that I just mean he's already been appropriated into the tradition, and so he doesn't quite seem as human. An interesting example of this is that in the Syriac translation of the life of Anthony, Anthony's pain is diminished. In other words, there's a big scene. So I should tell you, perhaps for those of you who don't know Anthony's story as well, Anthony is a rich middle to upper middle class young man who gives up his life to become a monk. So he flees from the city to go out into the desert, literally to seek a greater devotion to God. And when he goes into the desert, he gets beaten up by demons, really beaten up. And so in the Greek life, Athanasius talks about the beatings were so intense that people could actually hear them. It's a big, big theme that he suffers, this torture. And that gets downplayed in the Syriac version. It sort of diminishes that. In the Syriac life, the Bible is quoted a lot more. Anthony is also described, the Syriac translator talks about Anthony himself as a pure offering to God. He uses the term offering to God. So the monk is himself an offering, and he's quoting scripture all the time. That's the easiest thing to see when you read and compare the two different versions of the life. You also see, so as I said, the story of St. Anthony Athanasius talks a lot about his youth in the beginning of the text. And one of the interesting things is that the Syriac version makes him look already as a young man quite distinct from his peers. So they really turn him into a superhero, even as a young person. Like Jesus, who's found teaching in the temple, the Syriac Anthony is already teaching his peers, for instance, even at a young age. Even as a little boy in the Syriac life, he's honored as the head of his household. And this is also to accentuate what Anthony gives up, because it talks about how much wealth he has. So the Syriac life spends a lot more time saying that they came from a very wealthy family. They even had slaves in the story. That's absent, I think, from the Greek life. They says that Anthony in the Syriac life says that Anthony gave away 300 fields. And so again, it's trying to accentuate what Anthony gives up when he becomes a monk. If you will be my disciple, go and sell all of your goods. This is what Anthony hears in church, which makes him want to become a monk. And that how he answers that call is much more accentuated in the Syriac version. And so you also see, and this is interesting because both stories talk about that Anthony sends his sister to become a nun, sends his sister to become a sister. But in the Syriac version, it says that he sends her to become a daughter of the covenant. baknokione. And so that's kind of fun too, to see that idiom of the Syriac B'nai B'nath Kiyama enter into the story. They're just called trusted virgins in the Greek. They're not called daughters of the covenant. And then immediately too, it talks about monks gravitating to Anthony. So you have this vision that already Anthony isn't just the father of the monks, that there were already a lot of other monks around. So there's this presumption in the later version that there was already a lot of monks who've that living in that. I'm afraid to look at the Syriac. Is that right? Nope, it's not. Just ignore the Syriac. I'm so sorry about that. My apologies. Anthony is, again, he's trained in monastic virtues, but he's already there at an earlier phase. So again, this tendency in later versions of saints' lives to kind of suggest that a saint has actually always demonstrated a certain type of holiness. They don't need to grow. In the earlier version, Athanasius talks about how Anthony has to go through all these steps to become what he becomes. In the later version, it's almost like he just kind of jumps over a lot of those things, and he's already there. But perhaps, again, one of my favorite distinctions in the Syriac life is this title that Anthony is an angel of light. Okay, no, that one's right. There we go. So in the Greek life, Athanasius does talk about, so the context of this quotation is that Anthony spends a lot of time in a cave, in ascetic practices, in undergoing these trials. And when he comes out, he looks fantastic. And he looks beautiful. Despite all of his fasting, despite the fact that he's been beaten up, he looks great. He looks healthy, he's strong, he's not too thin, he's not too fat, whatever. He's radiant. He is an example, really. He's demonstrating what it means to become like God, right? Back to this theology, Athanasius, God becomes human so that humans can become like God. Well, Anthony is showing what that looks like now, to become like God. In the Syriac version, it says, when he went forth as one coming forth from the depths of the earth, they saw his appearance as an angel of light. An angel of light. And they wondered how his body was not weakened by being enclosed, nor was his mind depressed. So again, it's showing not just that he's healthy, but he wasn't sad. It's very interesting. So, but the monk is this angel of light. This is what, instead of this is the accentuation of the Syriac life. Also, there's a lot more discourses in the later version about what a monk should be. And one of the interesting analogies that they use is that the monk is a one of pilgrimage, seeking a place in the land of sorry, I messed up on that slide. A land of the living. And so he says, we are not the Lord of deeds, but pilgrims. And so the monastic life is presented as one of constant of journeying or pilgrimage. One of the most common deeds or words used to describe the life of Anthony in the Syriac life is his heroic deeds. He spends a whole lot of time talking about the outstanding things that Anthony is doing. He goes and visits the imprisoned, and there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that he was poor. So the poverty, his rags, that he also is demonstrating a simplicity of life, a solidarity with those who are with the poor of his society. And the reason I bring that up is we're going to talk about how poverty or simplicity, living as one in need, is a theme that you see in other Syriac saints' lives as well. Here comes another Syriac word. I'm afraid to turn now. Is it gonna? Yes, that one is right. Okay. Yeah, again, another beautiful difference between the Syriac and the Greek life is that in the Syriac life, the monastery is described not as a city, which is the language that Athanasius uses, but a tabernacle, a shekintha. The monastery is the tabernacle, which is a much richer, in many ways, is a much more biblical image than that of a city. From the beginning, from that time, the monastery began to grow great and increase in the desert and on the mountain in the likeness of the shekintha that was in the new world. And so the monks together create this new place of dwelling for God in the tabernacle, in their monastic tabernacle, instead of a city. So it has a very different connotation to speak of a monastery as a city versus as a tabernacle. I'll let you just sort of kind of think through that on your own. I think one of the funnest, this is one of my favorite differences too, is the sense imagery. And I bring this one up in honor of my daughter, who really likes snakes. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and she thinks snakes are pretty cool. So we're talking about there's a scene in the life of Anthony where he goes into his cave, and the animals sense him. And so there's this scene of the reptiles in chapter 12. Now, the reptiles that were there at that time, that the Blessed One was reaching there, conceded that place to him easily. So again, you have the animal saint thing going on. In this case, you have the snakes moving over in their cave to give some space to Anthony. Each one of them hastened as if Anthony's smell was different to them. My Dr. Mutter, Susan Harvey, would really like this. She's worked a lot on scent. So the saint smells differently. It's that scent of holiness that she's written so beautifully about. So even the reptiles can smell Anthony in a different way. It's a way of indicating holiness. They knew that he was not a man from among men. So this beautiful story in the saints' lives, that the snakes themselves can sense that Anthony is distinct because he doesn't smell like them. I really like that scene. And then finally, or not finally, almost finally, I used to not like that when my professors would do that. They would sort of hint that they were about to finish and then go on for another, half an hour. I'm sure you who preach never do that to your congregation. By the way, these images here, this is from the monastery of St. Anthony in the Red Sea. There's a lot of language in the Syriac life of Anthony, of how Anthony teaches monks how to pray. And so he has this beautiful scene too, to show how prayer and liturgical practices scare the devil away. If you want to torture the devil, you sing the Psalms, he says. This is really nice. So just remember that next time you find yourself in that predicament. Singing the Psalms is a good way to torture the devil. In Syriac hagiography, there's a lot of emphasis on healing. That's a big theme in many of the lives of the saints. Christ himself is described as the great physician, as the good physician. This is what he's doing most of all in the New Testament. He's healing, after all. And so healing is a big, powerful motif and metaphor in many Syriac saints' lives. And throughout the Syriac version of the life of Anthony, Anthony is described as a good doctor, as a wise physician. And he has a sensibility and a sensitivity to cure remedies according to the nature of these different illnesses. And what's so beautiful at the end of the story, it has this cute turn of phrase that even after his long life, all of his ascetic practices, it's like some sort of late ancient like miracle youth drug, the more he's practiced asceticism, the younger that he looks. And so this idea is that you are actually going to improve your health and your well-being through your ascetic practices, and people will see you as someone different. Again, this anticipation here on earth, your resurrected form is going to be sort of previewed. You're going to look younger. They said he looked after years of ascetic practice, he looked renewed like an eagle. So there's just some really beautiful differences there that are kind of give you a little bit of an epitome of Syriac idioms, especially in the ascetic context, of holiness and monastic life. I'm gonna just take a quick drink of water. Are you with me?
Yes.
We have 10 more minutes. All right. I know that it's okay. It's okay if you need to finish your naps. Okay. One of my favorite stories that I wanted to bring into as Syriac saints' lives is the story of the man of God. Have any of you heard of this? Some of you maybe know this.
Alexis?
Yeah, he's also known as Saint Alexis in other traditions. The man of God is a beautiful story from Syriac tradition, which tells the tale of a young man from Rome who grew up from a very, very wealthy background, like tons of money. He was born to parents who had waited a long time to have a child. That's a very common motif. It's from the Bible. You see it in a lot of saints' lives that a saint is born to parents in some sort of miraculous way. Either they thought they couldn't have a child and then God hears their prayer, or something like that. That is a typical motif. Children in many saints' lives will already demonstrate their holiness through unusual behaviors. There's a funny example of this in the life of, this is the Greek life of Simeon the Younger, I believe. St. Simeon the Younger, when he refuses to nurse from both of his mother's breasts because he's practicing asceticism, so he'll only, it's one for the moms out there. Yeah, but anyway, but you'll see some of these, sometimes the child in saints' lives is kind of, it's a little humorous. In any case, in the man of God, he's getting groomed for a life in service, an imperial service. He's getting great education, all these things. He has servants. He's got he's engaged to a wonderful girl. And then on the day of his wedding, he decides to give it all up. He doesn't want this. So he sneaks away, gets on a boat, and goes to Edessa.
Runaway groom.
So yeah, I guess it is like the runaway groom. And this breaks his parents' hearts. But you have this man, it's a story of a transformation, of a conversion. And in this case here, his conversion isn't really, it's not just to Christianity, it's to a life of anonymity. He loses his name. We're back to this naming thing again. We've been talking about names today. It's interesting how themes can recur. It's an interesting thing. So here you have someone who's going to give up his name to take on a life of namelessness in a whole new city. As a refugee of sorts, as a foreigner. He leaves Rome, he goes to Edessa. Here's this wealthy person. Nobody knows who he is. He lives He lives the life of a beggar. He lives the life of a beggar on the streets of Edessa. And at night he prays. At night he prays when no one's around. So a big theme in the story is the importance of the sort of the holy people whom we see, the holy people whom we don't see. Whom do we see? Whom do we not see? And here you have this man, and the story is teaching too that holiness is in poverty. This is sounding again very similar to St. Francis. We talked about this earlier. He gives up everything to live this life of poverty. And only the janitor of the church sees him at night. Here's another humble person. Notice that. It's the one who's cleaning the churches at night who sees this man and wonders what it's all about. So to fast forward, the man's groomsman is sent out from Rome to go looking for his friend. And when the word gets out about this, the man of God, again, he loses his name, reveals to the janitor his background and tells him to keep it secret. He doesn't want anyone to know. And then eventually he dies. And I've left some of those stories out because it's a longer story. But the point is, this whole person's life consisted in living a life. His holiness consisted in a life of living as a fool, in foolish poverty that nobody could understand. And it's only after he dies that you get this revelation that this was actually a very important person who had a lot of wealth and gave all that up. So the story of the man of God comes into other traditions. This is an icon. He was said to have lived under the steps, so you can see him under the steps there. He's known as Saint Alexius in other traditions. So he gains a name in other traditions, but in the Syriac tradition, he's just the man of God. And there's actually, he's venerated in Rome too, and you can see, I've forgotten which church, I'd have to go back and check. There's a church which has a shrine to the man of God. It also features that staircase.
Did he eventually live back in his parents' house in a cubby hole underneath?
In different versions, in some versions of the story, he does that. Yeah, he actually ends up going back. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So then we're just going to end finally with a quick discussion of Saint Simeon the Stylite. Simeon the Stylite is one of the most popular Syriac saints, and his life exists in many different languages. I've been talking to Father Armando about another translation there was this homily by Jacob of Chasselou's that's going to Sebastian Bach translated. Much has been written about him by scholars. He's a very fascinating, compelling figure. And it's interesting to compare St. Simeon's life with St. Anthony's. St. Simeon grew up in Syria. He was a shepherd, and his conversion came from the idea, from the Beatitudes of blessed are they who mourn. Blessed are they who mourn. And so for him, the life of holiness is one of mourning. And some of the traditions of Syriac monks call them the abile, the mourners, actually. In any case, so he wants to become a monk. He joins a monastery, but his ascetic practices are famously too much for his fellow monks to handle. He's always like one-upping them. You know, if they're all doing their thing, and Simeon has a belt underneath his shirt to make it tighter. He's always inflicting more pain. I say to my students sometimes, it's like that kid who won't. We're all done studying, and you're going to stay up and study for 5 more hours, and make the rest of us feel bad. It's kind of like that. Not good for communal life, right? Those kinds of people. Creates competition and discord. So he gets kicked out of the monastery, no place for Simeon, and eventually he builds a pillar for himself. And as I said, there are various traditions of Saint Simeon the Stylite, both in Greek and in Syriac. And his pillar, to see him up on his pillar, living with his arms outstretched, living this embodiment of suffering, of devotion, literally between heaven and earth, was a striking sight for many to see. And the idea in the stories of St. Simeon was that he hoped, or the theological sort of justification for this admittedly strange behavior was that through acting this way, you can get people to think about their own life. In other words, it's like a prophet. You do something that's strange in order to make other people consider their own life. Now that you're looking at me, why don't you look at yourself? You know, and so with the attention that people gave him on top of his pillar, he was able to be a religious authority and even negotiate in non-religious affairs. And there was a lot of controversy, and this actually gets articulated in the stories about Saint Simeon. Some people didn't really know what this was all about. Why should we think of this as a holiness? There was even sort of even in ancient times, why isn't this just crazy? And so you see them even debating about this, and trying to show that Simeon is in fact a human being. He really did do this. The most graphic image is that yes, he's real, his body is real. He even had a really disgusting ulcer on his leg from his practices. It was so disgusting that it was an ulcer that was boiling and stinky and all these things. And so there's this great emphasis in the lives of Simeon to show he really did this, he really suffered this, and God glorified him. And this becomes he becomes a very popular saint. Many people, just to go back here to his pillar, the pillar of Kalat Siman becomes a place of great pilgrimage, and his site is built up by people who promoted devotion to Simeon. People want to go and get tokens from the place where Simeon was, and to get his token was like to get his blessing. So in the Syriac world, then that superstar, that ascetic superstar of Simeon the Stylite, gave rise to other Stylite saints. I mean, who would have ever thought that would become a popular thing? I mean, talk about an unlikely development in history, but a very colorful and interesting one. Although, as I said, unfortunately, we don't seem to have this anymore. At least not that I know of. Maybe some of you know of some Stylites.
There's an app for it.
There's an right. But it certainly gets to very interesting questions about models of holiness and sanctity and discipleship. And it's always a good chance as we read these stories, as we read the lives of the saints, also, I think, to let their lives read us, to let them turn around and look at us. And so we can ask ourselves, how are we modeling discipleship now today? What does our world need today to be encouraged, to be inspired? I think that's a really important question. So beyond entertaining, it's really important just to see these as cherished treasures of the church, because that's indeed what the saints are. They're powerful. We can ask for their help, and I think it's just a wonderful opportunity to retell their stories and keep them alive today. So thank you. I'll be talking about the women tomorrow, by the way. So okay. That is clear. And again, welcome conversations about this. Yeah, please.
The lives of Saint Anthony and Syriac, do any of them exist in English translation?
No, it's in French translation by Draguet. It's possible that someone's translated it, but I don't think that anyone's published that, not that I'm aware of.
It'd be interesting to see the parallel.
Yeah. And since they exist in so many manuscripts, it's a little bit complicated. I mean, we could certainly, nobody's done that work yet, I don't think, into English. Dragouet did it in French. Yes, please.
I have a question. Who came before Saint Anthony or Saint Maron?
Saint Anthony.
Saint Anthony.
Saint Anthony.
Saint Anthony. He's three. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
he comes in the 3rd century. Yeah, his life is in the 4th century,
But there was Paul the Hermit before him.
according to
We
according to
always,
Jerome.
Huh?
in our religious, upbringing, we talk about the martyr.
Hmm.
We always talk about the monk as a living martyr.
Right, the living martyr.
He's a living martyr, which means you have, coming from that perspective, you're alive, but you're a martyr because you have to sacrifice everything for the sake of the kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a constant sacrifice rather than one single one. Thank you.
Well, monasticism basically developed out of when martyrdom ended.
According to Susan Harvey, not in the Syriac world, asceticism was built into Syriac Christianity. It was not because martyrdom stopped. Yeah, it was built in the Christianity itself, which is an interesting thing that we saw.
It is, but not in the monastic form, I don't think. Like,
We have 2 questions in the back.
Thank you for this beautiful presentation. For those of us who have the tendency to be stylites, can you please, if there are information or knowledge of the practicality of the stylite life, the basic human needs of food, etc. Do we have any information about that? And many of us, I wonder, would ask how did they shower, how did they sleep, etc.
no shower.
Do we have any information about that?
Natural shower.
The scent to follow.
Yes, there is actually. To answer your question, there is, and there are pictures about there are different depictions or descriptions of waste removal and feeding, and people who would tend to the stylites to help them in those things, in those human needs. But I don't know off the top of my head, and I hesitate. It's possible that we know more, and I'm just not recalling on my feet right now about the practical aspects. But people have certainly written about that. I just can't remember. Thank you. Sorry for that. Was a very poor answer. Yes, Bishop.
So for asceticism, is there much in the Syriac tradition on being ascetical like Christ's asceticism?
Yes. In fact, that's across the board. For instance, in Jacob of Suruj talks about this in fasting, that when you fast, you should look to Jesus who fasted in the desert. So your point, when you're having a hard time, if you're suffering from hunger or you're fasting or you're tempted not to follow through, you look to the example of Jesus. And so, for instance, the fast is seen as the first way to fight Satan. When Jesus goes out into the desert, he fasts, and Satan tries to tempt him with food in that moment of hunger. And so there's an undoing of what Eve gave into the eating, And so I've worked on this a little bit with my study of gluttony. That's why some of them thought that gluttony was the first sin. She ate, and so Jesus instead, when Satan comes in with him, turn the stones into bread, and he says no, he undoes that. So yes. There's always, though, one of the things that I appreciate about a lot of monastic theology, it's in Syriac theology, but other too, is that as much as this is very extreme, this is admittedly very extreme, this is not what most of them were doing, right? This is important to emphasize that. There's always there's always an emphasis on charity and hospitality in the monastic literature. No matter what you're doing, if it turns you into a grumpy person, that's missing the point. In other words, you're supposed to reflect Christ's charity in your actions. So if your fasting is making you mean, if you refuse to break your fast to welcome a brother and share a meal with him, you're missing the point. Yeah.
Which brings me to another question.
Yeah.
One of the things I think that often gets missing in the asceticism of Christ is that he was getting beat up all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like St. Anthony, by the demons.
Right.
But I think Christ was being clobbered and beaten up by the scribes, the Pharisees, the critics, the angry people,
Right.
So, and in his interior, he developed an ability to overlook, to forgive, to confront, to develop his own anger,
Mm-hmm.
not towards people, but towards attitudes and towards a sinful oppression of other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much is written about that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, isn't it? I mean, reflecting on it gives a richer idea to self-control, because it's one thing to be self-controlled if you're just by yourself, but when people are, and in many ways that psychological battles, what we would call them, they wouldn't use that term, but that's really what it was, intellectual, that ripping down, that tearing down.
And that's something very helpful, sorry to say, for pastors.
Mm-hmm.
You know, many pastors find it so difficult to be criticized.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Right, because you're giving up so much for this role,
right.
and people forget that or overlook that, or they don't consider that there's a human person that they're talking to and not. Yeah.
But I think even with Christ, it wasn't even those like against him, it's those wanting something from him, battering them with needs, always after him. Heal me, heal me. You know, it's like no rest for the
Mm-hmm.
weary, you know, that idea.
Yeah, and
I don't think that bothers pastors enough.
Yeah.
But what bothers pastors is, you say no and they get angry. At the church, you try to guide and they get upset. So I'm just wondering if there's anything in literature, especially Syriac literature, that talks about that.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure if I, reflect and have more time to think about it. Yeah, I mean, it's, well, it's the difficulty of accepting that your suffering as a disciple might not be physical. I mean, physical suffering might be the more obvious thing, but for other people, it could be that your reputation gets crucified, that people's respect for you gets crucified, that
Life
your
of a priest and life of a bishop is a good example.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways that perhaps, I mean, it's to take another example, I mean, families with children that suffer from mental health will often say that it's hard for them that people can't see what their kids are suffering because it's not obvious in the way that a physical challenge is. So there's a lot more nuanced ways of thinking about these. But whether or not the Syriac, I don't know at the top of my head, but I would imagine so. Ephraim and Jacob both talk about pastors and shepherds. I have to think a little bit more about that, but I appreciate the point. Yeah.
One more question or two more questions at most?
Where was Simeon the stylist?
When?
Where?
Where? So if I had, I could show you on my Syriac map if I could pull that up, but Kalat Siman can show you. Just outside of the city of Antioch, of Antakya. It's in Syria.
Not far from where ISIS was.
The pillar is no longer there, right? Wasn't it bombed?
It's
Close to Aleppo, Broad
it's-
area.
yeah.
Broad area.
Kalat Siman.
And they think that he was
No, it's Aleppo.
in a Maronite
Turkey.
monastery.
And Turkey.
Really?
That's what a lot of talk about.
That on our calendar, disciple of Saint Maron. I call bunk on that one.
It's close to Broad area outside Aleppo, close to Antioch.
Where's
So,
St. Maron?
Turkey.
Not far from where St. Maron.
Correct.
No, yes, but our monks were going to his where the monastery where his pillar was. There wasn't a monastery there until after his pillar.
Okay.
He
Let's see.
like you said, he got kicked out of the monks.
He probably got kicked out of the
So when you
Maronite
go into
monastery.
this site, type in.
See if I can. You gonna cooperate with me? Oh,
Oops.
there it is. Okay. So there, and maybe easier to see. I'll open it and, well, I didn't mean to hit Google Maps, but anyway, there it is. So you can see here, now I will use the pillar, or the pointer.
Always.
See.
Do you want me to make it a little bit bigger?
That's Aleppo here, and then Kalat Siman was there. And Antakya over here. This is ancient Antioch, Antakya today, Kalat Siman, Aleppo. So it was at the center of a crossroads, which is important to note because it shows that many people would have seen him. He was not out in the middle. Yeah. Someday I'd like to go there. I hope. Maybe.
It's not safe now,
Right now it's.
unless you want to be a martyr.
Has anyone here been there by any chance? Oh, you have? Okay. Would you like to say anything about what you saw?
Just we went with the seminary. It was the end of the year excursion. We went together, and the same picture you showed us. That's the church. Still have some like remnant of the
stone.
column. It's still there. But
Not
it's
now.
Small part of it. We took pictures.
Uh-huh.
When was that?
In like 7 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's gone now. I think a missile actually from ISIS destroyed it. I'm pretty sure. There's a
How big was
crater
the
now.
style?
Thank you, everybody.